I got that right? Switch B shows a 0 and a 1. Whoops. Pardon me. Shows a 0 and a 1 over here. So now watch this wackiness. Right now we're all combined, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to increase a bunch of, or wait a minute, I don't want to do a bunch of expo. Okay, now watch what happens. All right, so switch B is up. I switch B down. Notice it turns off the expo. I'm not even doing an idle up yet. All right, but watch this. Since they're all combined, switch B still controls. I go into idle 2. Switch B still controls this, right? But let's say I'm in normal and I change this to separate. Okay, so I've got the expo in normal, and when I switch down, it's off on switch B. See that? I'm not changing modes. All right, so now I'm going to go into idle 1. All right, and switch B. Now, I can have these quadruple expo dual rates. So now let me reset. Let me turn switch B up. I'm going to hit reset. So now switch B, right, does nothing, even though it's changing the number up here. And when I go into normal, I have my dual rate, and switch B still turns it off. All right, so now, since we separated normal, normal is separated from every other condition. If I go into idle up, again, switch B is not doing anything. Well, I can set a different rate on switch B. Let's say I want idle up to be some kind of weird positive expo. Now watch what happens. Switch B turns it off, switch B turns it on. Okay, so there's normal. Normal, I've got a negative expo, and switch B can turn it on and off. All right, and that's the way it be because I separated it. Now I go into idle up 1, and by default with switch B up, I've got this negative expo, but I can turn it off with switch B as well. All right, so understand you can get a huge amount of expo or dual rate control tied to both your idle up switches and be able to make different settings based on another switch that you set over here. I hope that's making sense. Play with it. You'll make sure you'll understand. So let me go into idle up 1. I'm going to change that to a separate just to give another example. I'm going to reset. All right, so let's make sure switch B isn't doing anything. All right, so normal, here we go again. Normal with switch B up, which is off. The zero's up here. I've got 47%. Switch it down, I can turn it off. All right, idle up 1. I've reset it to 0. Switch B does nothing. But let's say switch B down, up, I can add a bunch of positive. All right, and then switch B turns it off. All right, that's cool. So there's normal. Switch B turns it off. There's idle 1. Switch B turns it off. Now I go into idle 3 because I separated, idle 2 because I separated idle 1. Watch, I go into idle 2, and even though it's got a setting, I can reset it to 0, and I can make idle 2 not have anything with switch B. So, again, normal, 47%, switch B turns it off. Idle 1, 55%, switch B turns it off. Idle 2, because it's now separate, there's nothing, even with switch B. All right, so you can get a huge amount of combinations there, having it tied to your idle up conditions when you do a separate, or having a switch control, whether it's on or off, or even other settings. For instance, switch B right now is turning it off, but I could make switch B go the other way. So now, switch B gives me either that or that in normal, all right? See that? That's switch B toggling, I'm in normal. I go into idle up, switch B now is back to turning it off because that's what I had set. Man, I know that's complicated, I know it covers a lot, but that's what combined separate does, as well as selecting a switch. Combined separate will be very important later on pitch and throttle curves, so it's important you understand how to separate your conditions and get different settings, as well as tying it to a switch if you want. Make sense? So that's a little bit of a long video. That is dual rate expo. I think I covered everything, and we'll continue on. By the way, one last thing I want to cover is dual rates you can drive past your EPA. Now, let me just talk about that a little bit. Some Futaboretos have both travel adjust and EPA. Travel adjust is your max. EPA is your endpoint adjust. So, or vice versa. I don't remember now, but either way. On this radio, EPA sets how far your servos can travel. However, dual rates and this offset can drive your servos farther than what your EPAs are. So for instance, I can set up a dual rate that is more than 100% of my EPA. What that means is if my EPAs are 100 and I set this dual rate to 120, that means when I move the stick, it will make the servo travel past the EPA. You need to understand that if you're trying to do something like positive EPAs. All right, but what this video segment's about is offset. Offset moves the whole graph, and let me show you what that means. I wanted to touch on EPA and overdriving simply because it's important to understand. So I've moved this offset, and actually let me put in a bunch of expo and let me show you why you may or may not use this. All right, so there's a bunch of expo, and I offset the graph 50%. So watch when I move the aileron stick. When I move, I'm going to get this very quick movement, but on this side where the expo dialed in, I'll get this gradual curve. But there's something important to understand here. Because I offset this, this would be one way you could use to get, say, a weird expo on one side of the stick versus a different expo on the other. But my point is here is because I've offset this graph, let's go to our friend, the monitor menu, and see what happens when I offset. Notice the stick is not centered. Well, of course, that makes sense. I go in here, and you'll see with my center stick, the graph where my servo is going to be is way up here. All right, so let's go back and show you the other fact. The other fact is when I move the stick, notice I'm going well beyond my 100%, and here I'm not even going close to my 100% because I offset that scale. All right, so understand that's what offset does. I normally don't ever use this for anything. Not sure why you would, but it's not something I normally use, but I wanted you to understand what offset does. It offsets that graph on how the servo moves inside. Okay, so with that finishes up Dual Rates Expo, and hopefully it was helpful, and we'll continue on. And once again, one other thing I didn't cover, which I kind of thought would be simple to figure out. But remember, when we first came into this menu, Dual Rate Expo, aileron was the first choice. And of course, you can change elevator, rudder, and aileron back to aileron. So you can do aileron, elevator, rudder, all the same kind of setup. All right, so just remember, if you want to add elevator expo, you got to change to elevator. All right, so that's what that's all about. Anyway, forgot to cover that one little section, and that should cover dual rate and exponential.